Balaji, welcome back to the What is Money show.
Great to be here.
So you said something really interesting to me in our conversation last week, and I want to pose it to you as a question. When the Fed fails, we buy Bitcoin. When the police fail, we buy guns. But what happens when the US military fails?
Right. This is actually the question that I have been thinking about quite a bit over the last few weeks and months. And first, one thing I've started to try to do is to establish premises. And then if you disagree with the premises, then you're going to disagree with the conclusion. But at least you can kind of see if you disagree with those and then see if you disagree with the conclusion. So what are the premises? So first is, about 6 months ago, I talked about actually more than maybe all year of a year ago, I was observing that the US military had been MIA during COVID. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that the military has something called a National Biodefense Strategy. Since 2001 with anthrax, they've been spending billions on biodefense. There were trial runs with SARS and then Ebola, literally billions of dollars over many years. There's this whole thing you can Google National Biodefense Strategy for man-made and natural threats. And at the beginning of COVID, on a daily basis, one observes the incompetence of municipal or state or federal government. In San Francisco, there's a $300 million bus lane. California can't keep the power on with PG&E or the fires out. And, obviously the federal government is incapable of doing many things, like from setting up the healthcare.gov website to, like even negotiating an agreement, balancing the budget, any of that stuff. So you can observe all these failures in civilian government. But in many ways, when we think about the military, we, unless you're on a foreign battlefield or involved in the military, you don't have direct experience of it. And what is your experience of it? Well, it's some of it just comes from news articles, but where would you think, Robert, where do most people's visuals of the US military come from?
These days, probably YouTube.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. So YouTube, I was going to say Hollywood movies.
Oh, yeah. Even better.
Right. And in fact, the military actually works with Hollywood to lend them helicopters and this and that to kind of, because they understand how important perception is. In fact, maybe that might be the only thing they optimize nowadays is that perception. So Transformers or what have you. The US military likes to cast themselves as, coming in to save the world from aliens or supervillains or stuff like that, and they're always the good guys and super powerful and whatnot. And the reason that's important is, in the movie Jurassic Park, which is very meta, using a movie reference to explain movie references, they use like amphibian DNA to tile over the parts of the dinosaur genome that they can't reconstruct.
Right.
And so that, of course, leads to disaster later because, it gives them like, reproductive capability that they thought that these things didn't have. Yeah. But in the same way go ahead, you're saying?
No, I was saying, yeah, I recall.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So in the same way, when we haven't observed something ourselves, like you've done work in finance and, we've both been on social media, of course, and, we know about Bitcoin and, I've done biology work, but for areas we have not observed directly, like unless you've been a veteran, the US military, you are implicitly, even if not explicitly, relying on the portrayals that you've seen in your head. Just because, you might discount them. You might be like, oh yeah, that's the movies, but you might still think, you know what? They may not be superheroes, but they're pretty competent. Right. And if you saw the movie Contagion, it portrays the CDC in a similar way as being competent, fundamentally competent, good-natured, smart, calm, like a CDC woman literally risks her life and dies, for basically public health. And, the CDC is, it's a very difficult situation. Lots of people die, but they're at least sober, dedicated public servants. And lacking something else, those are the mental models we apply. And I don't actually really fault people for that because otherwise you need to do independent research and, and so on. So before COVID, I think people could be excused for thinking that despite all the civilian government incompetence that we saw, that there was a reserve of competence in the US military. An unobserved reserve, but a reserve nonetheless. That is, in a time of true trouble, there would be, hard men, who would come out from behind the scenes and implement, whatever it took to get the country back on track, and like people will quote these Churchillisms like, the U.S. does everything else before it does the right thing, or the U.S. does the right thing after it does everything else, and, save the day. And that didn't happen. That did not happen. The U.S. military, despite these billions in biodefense spending, was completely MIA during COVID. Not only was it MIA, like an aircraft carrier was actually sidelined because of COVID. Like they took it offline, and that was reported in the Wall Street Journal. And the way the whole thing happened, that was like a breakdown in military intelligence. You're not supposed to say when, like something was sidelined or something like that. Like the military is not a free speech zone. There's things that are illegal in the military that are not in civilian world for all kinds of reasons. If it was a free speech zone, then you could go and blurt out the plans of your assault, and lots of things don't apply, right?
Yeah.
And so the thing about that was, the military set up the chairs in the Javits Center. That was something that people observed, and they had like a little flower next to people when they died. And so, this was something where at the beginning of COVID, like one scenario I had thought through was the possibility of martial law. Okay, because we kind of got something like that with lockdown, but it's a chaotic and TSA-ish martial law, as opposed to like a bureaucracy that has, the guys do have weapons, but it's the softest, most incompetent, porous, useless kind of thing, as opposed to the, for example, hard Chinese version where, let me just talk about that for a second. Lockdown is actually something where America copied China. People usually talk about China copying America, but America copied China because lockdown was something that came via China through Italy and then was copied by the US. That was basically the mimetic transmission of the virus, the mind virus.
Right.
And it was copied without admitting it was copied. See, when the Chinese copy something, they are shameless about it in both a bad and a good sense. They don't have shame when they're copying. They're like, what, we're copying. So we're going to go pixel by pixel, clone the whole thing, and then we're going to do the Chinese version and just out execute you on just raw speed. And often that works. And then they make it into their own thing. Like Meituan, the Chinese Groupon, started as a clone, but it's now very much out innovated Groupon. Okay.
Right.
So taking away ego, there's a bad aspect of shameless copying, but there's a good aspect of not having the ego to pretend you're not copying, right? The problem is that the West copied China, for example, in this context, without admitting it was copying. And the problem with that is, as I've mentioned, imagine like a Chinese gymnast going and doing a bunch of backflips, and then like a big, fat, out of shape American following them and trying to do the same thing, right?
Right.
Like that, you can't just mindlessly copy. You have to know about your own like resource constraints, right?
Yeah.
It is possible that the 1940s US could have done something as crazy as the Chinese lockdown. That was a highly organized state. It's unlikely. I don't know if the Chinese state under Mao could have accomplished something like their current lockdown. I doubt it, but maybe. It was certainly ruthless enough, but it wasn't competent enough. It was chaotic. But times change. And so the cargo cult copy of lockdown was something that the US lacked the state capacity to do. And so pulling it back up one level, this was not the CDC of the movies. This was not the military of the movies. This was the basically shambolic, catastrophic TSA, DMV government that we've all seen. The San Francisco government, the California government, the DMV government, the TSA government, the post office government, the American government,
Yeah.
And the American government circa 2020. And so that it was kind of an important card that got flipped over. And so what I started thinking about, and sometimes, you have to frame it in like a provocative way, right? The way I was thinking about it is COVID-19 was a military defeat for America. And why? Because military budget was allocated. This was something that the US military said that it was prepared to do to defend against man-made and natural threats. Billions of dollars were allocated for this. Number two, it was right in that, at the beginning, this wasn't obvious, but where COVID-19 is likely to end up is something like 10 million deaths worldwide. Okay, that's where it's tracking to. That's not the 100 million of the Spanish flu, but it's also not like sub 1 million, 100,000. It's like right in that kind of mid area. Okay. But it kind of doesn't matter for evaluating the military performance, because had it been more lethal, it's not like some capacity would have come off the sidelines. The capacity that came off the sidelines to deal with it were Pfizer and Moderna, namely like a startup and an existing scale biotech, quote, the private sector, that actually had some degree of competence and were pre-existing to the present moment. It wasn't like the military rolled this out. It is true that there was Operation Warp Speed, but that was actually led by a former pharma exec who just unblocked all the normal gates, right? I'm not sure the full story of that has really been told, but that was something where it's not like the U.S. government was running the fermentation reactions and stuff. So what's the point? So that was actually something where 12 months ago, 18 months ago, you could see that the US military in an area where it had allocated billions of dollars had been defeated. Defeated, right? Because another way of putting it is, what are WMDs? Do you know like the three things that are considered WMDs?
I don't.
It's nuclear, biological, chemical.
Okay. Yeah.
NBC is another acronym for it, right? And so nuclear weapons, supposedly invaded Iraq for that, right? Chemical weapons, that was supposed to be the red line over Syria. Biological weapons are absolutely something that is supposedly the military is supposed to have a defense for, and they didn't. So now look, you may say that's hard, you may say that's unfair, whatever, fine, but they allocated billions for it, right? So you start to think, well, actually this thing is a Maginot Line. You know the Maginot Line?
We talked about it a little bit last time, but I think you could revisit. It would be helpful.
Sure. So in France, like after World War I, they built a Maginot Line, which was a system of fortifications near the Franco-German border, where basically, I'm not sure if it's actually on the border of France and Germany, but it's basically in between the two. And the idea was that, hey, before they had fought all this trench warfare, now the next World War I, they would just sit up there in their nice fortified thing and shoot down on the Germans, and they would win. Problem is that the Germans, in the meantime, weren't stupid, and so they went and invented, basically mechanized warfare and blitzkrieg, and so their tanks just drove around.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say tanks. Now it's coming back to me now.
That's right. So just drive around this stationary thing, and so whatever ostensible defense there is against biowarfare does not exist, which is actually something that we should be concerned about. Also, on another dimension, by the way, I'm not, I like with respect to the vaccine thing, I basically just don't engage in debate on this in public because I think it's the stupidest thing in the world to be politicized, frankly. Like of all the things, what's the right way to put this? The fundamental issue is a lack of trust between parties. It's framed as a scientific debate, but it is something where if you were a red state person, or if you were not somebody who could go and look at the data, and you didn't feel like you diligence yourself, I understand why you wouldn't take it, right? But fundamentally, what that means is any society that can't put together the level of trust and or compliance and or harmony to get mass adoption of the vaccine in short order is vulnerable to a biowarfare attack. Right. Fair. This wasn't that, but it's kind of this opening bell that literally everybody in the world has seen this and how, quote, effective this was, in terms of knocking down societies. Yeah. And so if you can't do fast turnaround vaccination of your whole population, if they don't trust authority, you are societally vulnerable to a biowarfare attack. And maybe it won't be. See, one of the things about COVID is it's not spectacular like Ebola. People don't die melting down from blood, So it's deniable. Oh, they're just kind of choking to death in a hospital, and it's only fat people and old people or what have you. It doesn't really affect young, like children, right? We're lucky in that respect. The Spanish flu did go and kill young people, and that
blurs the line the other way too. Right, where you can actually start ascribing deaths that are not necessarily COVID cause to COVID. Yeah. So it really blurs the lines both ways.
And again, the thing is, I understand why there's distrust in authorities because, San Francisco is probably faking its crime statistics. It's they're pretending that thefts are down or something like that, and it's all just non-reporting. It's similar to the Soviet Union saying that Ukraine had a bountiful harvest in 1932. Yeah. the actual unambiguous thing is when you have a state that you can't trust. It was the signal of people actually, like Walgreens pulling 22 stores out of SF. You couldn't trust government. So I'm actually very sympathetic to the idea of individual sovereignty and so on. I'm just making the pragmatic argument that as a citizen in society, right, as somebody living in a collective, not everybody can diligence everything. I feel comfortable because I can actually go and read ACGT sequences. I know enough of the biotech founders and so on. I know how vaccines actually work. I'm also familiar, by the way, I'm not saying this as like a dunk or whatever. It is true that many countries required vaccination or vaccination certificates to enter the country prior to the current moment. You can go and look at that, like yellow fever or malaria vaccines. Like vaccines weren't controversial until recently, in the same way that fiat versus crypto wasn't controversial, in the same way that gender wasn't controversial. There are things that were sort of alignment points that in society that are now coming undone. And maybe everybody was just canalized and forced into this, like column of the 1950s where it's a W-2 employment and you've got a single job and you watch I Love Lucy and you all look at the same thing and everybody kind of shuffles off to work or whatever. And now we're getting diversity back, intellectual diversity, and breaks from that in all different directions. But the net of it is your society can't align. And I'm not attacking the people who didn't do it. I on their hand, I also don't want to live in a society which can't get that level of trust together because it's symptomatic of other things.
Right.
Like it is not really about consent versus coercion per se. It is about mutual trust and recognizing that or feeling that person in authority who's telling you X is, they're not saying, oh, wear a mask and then go to a party and take it off, where it just seems like some stupid hypocritical thing. That's something that anybody can understand, like Pelosi, or Gavin Newsom not wearing a mask when they tell you to wear a mask. You're a prole, you're supposed to wear a mask.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin.
The US military failed on COVID. It was very observable. It was a huge billions of dollars. They were defeated. They were defeated like with the aircraft carrier and so on. And so that made me realize that actually you cannot take the US military at their word on anything. I have to probe on, poke on that, just as we have to do on every other aspect of the government. And that actually, I said, months and months and months before the very public defeat in Afghanistan. You can see, like on the Ferris podcast, I talked about this. Okay. And people poke back on me and they're like, Balaji, I don't think that's right. You're overstating it. Because the reason is it's not exactly totally out of scope, but it's not totally within scope. It's like a borderline thing where people don't usually think about biowarfare as their core competency. When you point it out, it is, but it's just not something that they had that frame or narrative on, right?
Right.
Okay. So because of that, it wasn't like set up. It's kind of like saying Instagram defeated Kodak. Well, yeah, but they came at it from right angles. They weren't like a film company. They were coming at it as a digital camera company, effectively, or a camera app company. So, but with Afghanistan, it was much more clear. Okay.
Yeah.
6 months later, you have this catastrophic withdrawal. Now, this is a complicated issue, which you can argue, I think, several points at the same time, right? First, you can argue that like even Ron Paul voted to authorize military force to go after Al-Qaeda. I think that's legitimate. I also remember the mood in the country at that time And the problem is, as like, you know, a 20 something, or in your case, you're, you know, it's in very early 20s, you know, it's 2021, you were in your teens or whatever. You don't have the intelligence of the CIA. And so like all that stuff, you're basically going to trust that the government kind of knows what it's doing with this kind of thing. We didn't have social media. We didn't have other forms of information that were better, at least at first, you know? And so, you know, like when you're not paying that later, of course, are anti-war protests and so on. But as civilian, you really don't have any way to gainsay what military intelligence is saying. You're like, you know what? These guys have billions of dollars per year. The entire country's united. Throw my trust behind them, right. You know, go and kill the bad guys, right? We don't want more stuff to blow up, because the anthrax scare had also happened a few weeks later. So that authorization of military force, I think, was legitimate. Then, of course, that became, you know, the occupation, and then Iraq, and trying to transform it. I actually don't know if there's any options that were good. With hindsight, you can say, yeah, just do spec ops, you know, and just go and liquidate those guys and pop out. But you know, that's you could also say some people called for like shutdown of immigration, for example, right? Which lockdown is kind of done. And, you know, I think that's actually going to happen more in Europe than in the US. And so there are alternate paths that could have been taken. But, and I think, you know, like had the immigration shutdown, for example, just to talk about that for a second, had that been a total moratorium, as opposed to like singling out one group, I think people would have grumbled, but I think they would have been okay with it. That could have been a different direction that was taken. And, you know, and then you basically would just go and do spec ops, and you would be, you'd basically like look at visas from Saudis and so on. I mean, one of the issues was there's a quarter under the lamppost aspect of things where, you know, the quarter under the lamppost, you lost your quarter over here, but you're looking under the lamppost, right?
Right.
What seems to have been, you know, known at that time, and certainly today, is that all those guys were like Saudis, I believe, or many of them were Saudis, the ones at least who were reported as the hijackers. And yet Saudi Arabia really wasn't mentioned in any of this because they were an ally. And there was something that was recently declassified about like Saudi Arabian involvement in the hijackings or something like that. Okay. So you can look at that. So it was whatever. This has all been litigated, you know, for many, many years before the present day. Point being, you can argue as to why we got in there, what should have been done. In terms of the withdrawal itself, though, here's the thing that was problematic: was you're not saying amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Yes,
you brought that up. That's a good one. Yeah.
Okay, so that's not my coinage. That's like a famous you know military saying, right? Because it's not so much which tank's gun is going to win against another tank's gun. That's important. But a more important question is, how are you going to fuel the tanks? And how about the, you know, food for the soldiers? And are they going to be able to get over this terrain? And, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, you know,
all the administrative spreadsheet boring stuff is what actually matters.
Wins wars. Right. Yeah. And this withdrawal showed that the US military now sucks at logistics, because they were spotted $2 trillion and 20 years and total air superiority and total surveillance of all communications, and a government they had handpicked and a military that they had stood up, and like basically an ersatz civil society. Ersatz meaning it wasn't like real, but they had stood it up. Like all this NGO industrial complex, which by the way is right alongside the military industrial complex. It's like the priests who come in alongside the warriors when you occupy a territory. And even though they pretend to not like each other, they're really mutually enabling, because these guys justify the human rights, blah, 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 that says, you know, invade you for democracy.
This is good cop, bad cop at scale.
Exactly. It's the left hand washing the right. And, you know, the best way of even seeing that was that poster that was on the wall. Did you remember that? The one that the Taliban fighter was standing in front of the gun?
Slogans on the wall mean nothing to the guys with the guns. What are the slogans?
So on the wall, you have all of this, you know,
bullshit.
UN Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality, etc.
Yeah.
And in front, I feel bad for these people.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do feel bad for these people. They're being herded by a Taliban fighter with an AK.
Yeah.
The slogans on the wall. The thing about this is almost like a Renaissance painting, right? Because it shows something that is not normally, that's usually denied or not thought about, which is the NGO industrial complex is backed by military force.
Of course.
All of those slogans on the wall mean nothing if you do not have like the superior military force in that jurisdiction.
To impose it. Yeah.
To impose it.
Absolutely.
And it shows also that can be defeated.
Mm-hmm.
That is not actually an unstoppable thing of progress. And so that can be defeated and was defeated.
So the common theme I'm picking up on here is we have the U.S. military representing themselves as the most powerful and intelligent people in the room via the Hollywood movie mechanism.
Well, powerful. I'm not sure it's smartest, but yes, sure. Yep.
Yeah. Competent, let's just say.
Competent.
And
yes, competent. Yep.
We see something similar here with the UN Sustainable Development Goals plastered all over this war-torn region. But the truth beneath the veneer is that I'm postulating here, but that years or decades even of not being stress tested perhaps has actually cultivated incompetence within the U.S. military mechanism. So they're just trying to have their bark louder than their bark is becoming louder than their bite, so to speak.
That's right. Basically, like the thing about this is it's interesting because you think that the U.S. military goes to war constantly. There's actually a parody like of military procurement in the 1980s. There's like a movie. It's like something wars. Is it Pentagon Wars? I don't know. Yeah, here it is. Pentagon Wars, a Bradley fighting vehicle evolution. Okay. So that's like worth watching because this is from, oh gosh, when was this from? Because the reason is this starts to give a date on what you're talking about, right? This is 1998. Okay. So by 1998, the Bradley fighting vehicle project has been in development for 17 years at a cost of $14 billion. Okay. So I'm not a historian of the U.S. military, but this kind of stuff shows it's been going on for at least 20-something years. Now, we know that it wasn't going on for 70-something years because during World War II, the U.S. military was able to crank out and U.S. manufacturing was able to crank out like aircraft carriers like every few weeks. It was at this absolutely insane pace. So stuff that takes like more than a decade now, it took weeks then when they were really trying to do it. Because, for example, I'm not sure if this is apocryphal or true, but the stealth bomber was supposedly built in every state. Like that's to say, there are pieces that were split up among all 50 states so that all the senators would vote for it. Mm-hmm. And at least this is something that I remember reading. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it seems plausible because this way you would have, senator support for it. But that's not the most efficient way to build something. It is a way to do it where you maximize support, but you don't minimize cost or improve time, right? Yeah. So at some point along the line, the lack of necessity is the mother of degeneration, maybe, right? Mm. And so this was sort of masked because there wasn't a peer competitor. But here's the thing, so when the U.S. military was defeated in Afghanistan, we have to get rid of the cope, right? There's like kind of both right and left wing cope, and cope. You've heard that term?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah, it's like wishful thinking, basically, right? Yeah. And the first step in self improvement is just completely unvarnished. Rip, the greatest strength is knowing your own weakness. Rip the Band-Aid off. Yeah. Right.
Getting rid of the euphemisms. Right.
Yeah. And like realizing where one is, look, that's not to say being like cruel about it. Mm-hmm. Right. But just being honest. To be honest about it. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Right. And an honest evaluation is the only way that you can have a turnaround is to know how much one sucks or, mm-hmm. You need to know how much you suck, how much you're good at, and be like, calibrate that constantly. Mm-hmm. Right. And the thing is that very roughly, the left believes that the U.S. government is omnipotent domestically, and the right, the conservatives, believe that the U.S. military is omnipotent abroad. Mm-hmm. Right. And actually, much of what the U.S. government does domestically is pretty bad, and actually, much of what it does abroad is pretty bad, and it's pretty incompetent in both. So both of those things, people they get people, because they have this almost like monotheistic thing that they projected onto the state, like the All Father can both reward and punish. And people have projected from God into GOV, they believe in the state this way. And so when you critique it, it's not a rational reaction. It's like, why do you hate America so much?
Yeah.
I'm like, well, look, I actually do understand. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't people who do hate America. I mean, that does exist. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but there is a distinction in basically saying, this group that you think is defending freedom and that you have paid a lot of money to is not actually getting the job done versus I hate freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Those are distinct.
Right.
But anyway, I coming back though.
Sorry, I want to add to that point. I think it's a great, you call it something great here. So the way I think about this is that, time and money have a way to fill the budget allotted to them typically. And the picture I'm getting here of post World War II America is that it's basically been no challenges to its dominion.
Well, post Cold War America, I think the Soviet Union was
correct. Yeah. You're absolutely right. So this seems to be almost like a normal cycle of institutional rot at that level, where there's no forcing function of war to sharpen the U.S. government and make it competent. And then we get into people's perception of government. I like your point of GOV replacing God. You can't even comment on the organizational reality of the incentives that are rotting this institution, or lack thereof, let's say, because you're competing with people's deified fiction of government versus just some,
exactly,
like you said, the hard and fast truth, what's going on with this organization, profits and losses, where are we at? People don't look at it that way. People look at the government as if it's not a business, when in fact, every human organization is a business.
So it's okay. So let's talk about this for a second. This is a great thing to talk about. Something that took me a long time to understand, but then I was actually able to, I don't think even many people have articulated this themselves. Okay. But in tech, prior to COVID, there were folks, especially towards the later years, who would get quite offended when you pointed out how bad San Francisco city government was. Mm. And I would wonder how they could be on Mars here, right? And what I realized, some people would also get mad when you say this about New York or something. And eventually what I realized is that for these folks, especially the Johnny-come-latelys in tech, the employee number 100,000 or whatever, and by the way, let me explain why I say Johnny-come-lately, as opposed to a founder, right? As opposed to an early employee, as opposed to somebody who took significant risk. These are people, relatively speaking, who, and I'm sure some of your your listeners are among them, so no offense intended, okay? But relatively speaking, if you're employee number 100,000, let alone 1 million, you are taking less risk. And it is, to a greater extent, just a job. And so what I realized was, there's an identity stack for people. Some people are patriotic about their countries, others about their companies, still others about their cities, and yet others about their cryptocurrencies. It is what you identify as. Okay. Do you identify as a New Yorker? Do you identify as a founder or a technologist? Do you identify as an American? Do you identify as a maximalist? Right.
Right.
Then you're going to have something that is sort of sacred to you as your primary identity. And, so I realized then I was talking at cross purposes with this person. They were always going to be in New York or in San Francisco. They loved the Golden Gate Bridge. They loved, the park or whatever. And this was just a job to them. Who cares? I can get another job any day, right? To me, and to folks who thought like me, I'm like, hey, I don't mind going for a run outside. It's nice, but there's a lot of bridges around the world, a lot of sunsets. Can see a bridge, a lot of different places. There's a Verrazano's Bridge, whatever, in New York. I don't care about looking at the bridge, but what I do care about is building something like a bridge, but in virtual space, right? I care about that. I care about an environment that's conducive to building things I think of as important, not just getting a bagel or whatever, right? And so it's a fundamental cross purposes. So they were wondering why I cared so much about the companies that we funded, because we had poured our blood, sweat, and tears into this stuff, and these people were crapping on it. And they were mad that I was like, the city sucks, right? Mm-hmm. Because the question was, what are you a patriot towards, and what are you simply a customer of?
That right? Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And the thing is that many people are patriots towards something, okay? And, for example, for myself, I guess it would probably be mathematics and technology and the idea of space travel and, like human 2.0. And I know people call that transhumanism. And I know more recently that's gotten a bad rap, but Hal Finney was an extropian. And he believed in this stuff,
what is the term extropian?
Oh, EXTROPIAN. That's like, for example, freezing yourself to live longer or be revived. Gotcha. It's life extension. It's brain machine interface. It's all the awesome stuff. Frankly, I think that stuff is awesome, right? Now, I recognize there's people who don't like that and just want to be like, the most human they can be. And you can imagine sort of a handshake between the past and the future. Okay. We're both very dissatisfied with the present. And I'm totally okay with people living like a totally organic, and I don't mean this in a negative way, by the way. I'm going to say this, and I don't mean a quasi-Amish-ish life, right? While we floor it to get to Mars and, become one with the machine, and transcend, right? Like that's like why I'm in the game is infinity, right?
Yeah. And civilization is somewhere in the middle. Ultimately.
Well, so here's the thing is actually, so this is actually a very important thing. I do think that the future, not 5 years, but eventual political axis of the world, even more than centralization versus decentralization, is something like transhumanism versus anarcho-primitivism. Mm-hmm. Basically, humans being what they are, it is something where, both of those seem very extreme. Okay. But just to define what they are. Okay. There's actually a good debate. It was like Zoltan versus Zerzan. Okay. Zoltan is hilarious. It's pretty funny. Both have kind of, Z names or whatever. Zoltan versus Zerzan. It was like a little debate that I actually think would be way more important to the future. At Stanford University a few years ago, very sparse attendance. But it's like, how many people were attending the first Bitcoin meetups, Right. And essentially transhumanism and anarcho-primitivism, transhumanism is human 2.0, as I mentioned, brain machine interface, limb regeneration, CRISPR, genetic engineering, the whole 9 yards, right? Like, the negative version of it is constantly in movies, but you can imagine a positive version. For example, being able to live to 200 or forever, being able to reverse aging, being able to, colonize other planets, being able to, like swim underwater, take a pill and, basically have the equivalent of underwater breathing, all this kind of crazy stuff, uploading your consciousness, knowing everything from all time, glasses that give you Terminator vision, all this kind of stuff, right? That's transhumanism, is accelerate technology. And the argument is that the thing that distinguishes man from animal, that makes us human, is technology. Yeah. That's to say, like, that's why we are not apes. That's why we are not, for example, Richard Wrangham has a book called, I think, Cooking Made Us Human. I forget the exact title, but essentially argues that without technology, humans wouldn't be human because we cooked food. Rather, we could offload that to technology, and we adapted to pour more energy into our brains and less into metabolism. Right? Yeah,
it was economic specialization, right? We're pre-digesting our food, so we liberated more of our resources toward cognitive development.
Exactly. That's Wrangham's thesis, and he put some evidence for it. I think it's interesting. I think it's plausible. But there's a coevolution of the external implement and the human being, right?
I'm reading about this right now. Actually, I'm very fascinated. It's called material engagement theory, where we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm a big proponent of this. There's a coevolution between the creator and what we create
and the tool.
actually. And,
Yes,
and again, there's a Churchillism here too, where he says the buildings we make in turn make us. I think that same precept extends to tools.
Soros is in many ways kind of a bad guy, but he has this concept of reflexivity.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right. And we're also seeing this right now with the printed money, where it is actually affecting things in a nonlinear way. It is not simply competing for more goods. It is being deposited in people's bank accounts, which gives them leverage to, resign or do strikes, which is fine, except what it means is a labor shortage. And sometimes those labor shortages are in things like dock workers and truckers. So that's also giving a supply shortage. Mm-hmm. So you're having this flood of money causing both more money and less labor and less goods at the same time. And then that's going to jack the system into a state where it might be hard to recover from because a bunch of people quit. So you hired new people, they got de-skilled. You kind of took the thing apart and it might be hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Yeah. So,
and this is Bitcoin too, right? Or the inflexible supply. So the more you buy, demand increases can only be expressed in price, which drives more demand. And
that's right. Yeah. So coming back to this, basically, there's another thing, humans are called like the naked ape or something like that, right? And that's because we probably evolved to wear clothes, so we kind of just like cooking made us human. We've probably been wearing clothes for evolutionary time periods. Mm-hmm. So point being, the transhumanist argument is technology is not distinct from humanity. Technology is humanity, has naturally selected humanity. So floor it, dog. Let's take it all the way. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It's human reason embodied, right?
It's human reason embodied. That's right. And, how do you benchmark a civilization? I actually thought about this a lot. And how do we know if we had made progress in a real sense in the year 3000? It would be our descendants. Would they be more advanced in mathematics than we were? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Why? Because like if you've seen Contact, they communicate in prime numbers, right? Yeah. Or Arrival, these are like universals, right? And mathematics is, I can't imagine mathematics being different in different areas of space time, but physics could be. In theory, the laws of physics could be different. Yeah. We think of them as space time invariant, and you get symmetries out of that, but they could be different, I guess. Yeah. So coming back up, so basically, that's a transhumanist argument, right? And, we're descended from some combination of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens predecessors in this long evolutionary lineage. And we're not really doing well by our ancestors if we just flatline. We've got to exceed them. We got to beat that, right? And then against that is anarcho-primitivism, which says, and it starts with, so there's different flavors of it, both right and left. Okay. But it says we are polluting the oceans, we're warming the planet, we're also putting plastic into the water supply and it's causing testosterone crashing. We're looking at screens and we're not looking at the outside. We're not in tune with Mother Nature. These are very sterile environments. Men aren't warriors. People aren't meant to be cubicle drones. This is a combination of right and left arguments, right? That essentially a lot of people have it was interesting. I saw a super popular tweet. I was like, a lot of people have their dream of just going and living on a farm and getting out of the rat race. And that would actually make them happy. So they think is like growing these tomatoes or whatever on a farm. Right now, what do I think about this? I am sure that genuinely appeals to some people and they would actually like to do it if they could, but there's levels of it, right? There's levels. And what I mean by that is the Unabomber actually did just live in the wilderness as like a wild man. Okay. Now there's no flush toilets, right? That stuff gets really old really fast. There's no heating. There's actual wild animals and they're not in a zoo. There's bugs. There's no refrigerator. It sucks. It really does suck.
Real economic scarcities.
Real economic scarcities. That's right. Yeah. So true economic deprivation. So then you say, okay, no, that's not what I meant. Of course I meant X level of technology. Where is X? Okay.
Where do you draw the line?
The Amish have actually, go ahead.
I was going to say, where do you draw the line? Yeah.
Yeah. So now it's not impossible to draw a line. The Amish have actually done so. Mm-hmm. So you probably end up with something that's like Amish-like and then you have a boiling off or whatever. That's like the most realistic variant where we can see that. So you have various people who Amishify themselves at different levels. That's fine, right? People might want to freeze themselves in the fashions of the 1950s or restore, France of the 1800s. I don't know. Okay. Knock yourself out. You can have a little community like that, like The Town, I think is a movie by M. Night Shyamalan on something similar to that as a concept. Yeah. Do you remember that movie? I think
I do. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So you can sort of like, was it The Town? What was it called? It was The Village.
The Village. Yeah.
Yes, it was. Okay. So
I'm spoiling the bank robbery movie.
Yeah. The Town's bank robbery is The Village is the other one, right? So the Amish version is fine. It's realistic. Knock yourself out. Go and do it. I don't care. The dumb version, I think there's two dumb versions. There's a dumb version and there's the evil version. The dumb version, it's like people who think that it'd be really romantic to start a coffee shop. Okay. Like a farm is even more backbreaking labor than a coffee shop. Running a coffee shop sucks. Going to a coffee shop is great. You could just pay $5, whatever, sip some coffee. Okay. Do you know how commodity coffee shops are running them, especially today in like lockdown times? Because the state has failed, all of these poor restaurant owners have to basically run this sort of TSA like biohazard lab. I need to scrub down the countertops and it's like all stupid TSA nonsense. It doesn't, it's just like vaccines actually work. And once you've got a vaccine, fine. I understand that, but like the scrubbing of things when people have vaccines, I think it's whatever. Anyway, so, and you may disagree with me on this. It's fine. We're not going to be able to litigate that, but the point being that it's because running a coffee shop is hard and people underestimate that. I think they really underestimate how hard it is to run a farm. I mean, it's not Uber Eats. Okay. Like you can't just click a button and, the French fries come to your door. That potato has to grow out of the ground. That's not an on-demand process. It's the opposite of on-demand. It's high risk, but it's not just high risk. It's high risk for like this commodity product where you could have a potato famine. One of the things that's actually very hard to get one's head around is how difficult it is to do physical stuff and yet how cheap it is. That's a weird thing. Cheap in the sense of like, if you, you've eaten tomatoes, right? Probably.
Yeah.
Like growing tomatoes is not that easy. I mean, okay. Yeah. You can have a little tomato garden thing out there. Right. But like growing all the food that comes on your plate is a non-trivial exercise.
Yeah. I've seen a video on this where a guy made his own sandwich, I think from scratch.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And you realize the value of the division of labor, where if you're going to try to grow the grain and grow the tomatoes and, harvest the turkey and the cheese, I think it's a funny video. He spent like $50,000 on a sandwich, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. So this, by the way, is the same thing that in a different setting bedevils American hardware manufacturers versus the Chinese. Like, the first, with Apple being an exception, and there's other exceptions like Fitbit who just execute extraordinarily well and use China in the right way and so on, which might not be possible anymore in 2022, anymore. But like the American hardware manufacturer faces something really tough, which is it's super difficult to build a hardware product and make it robust and like, just like hardware is hard to iterate on, really hard. And that's why I was saying hardware is hard. And then have it out in the field and people messing with it and weird bugs and stuff. And then you have to if you have to have very high margins on your units to tolerate refunds. And, because if you only have 10% margins, then one refund eats a margin of 10 units, if it doesn't work. And so your error rates need to be really low. It's a really tough business. And yet, the moment it works, it'll get cloned by a bunch of Chinese competitors who are immune to any IP lawsuits. So it's both like super hard to get the 0 to 1, and it's not valuable, which breaks the human brain in some ways, right? Like really hard and not valuable, right? Not to say it can't be done. There are successful hardware companies. I mean, it's like Tesla, obviously. SpaceX. Like Elon is insane in the level of difficulty of what he's done. It's actually insane what he's done. But because he started so early too, before many of the other big companies. Anduril's out there. Oculus managed to do stuff. Like it's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just very difficult. And farming is difficult. And now where I think it is interesting, okay, and this is not the anarcho-primitivists, but maybe this is the resolution between the transhumanists and anarcho-primitivists. You know what I do think is becoming more and more feasible?
What's that?
Individual or small community robotic farming.
Okay.
Agricultural robotics is quietly doing extremely well. I mean, this is the type of stuff which people should know about, not some stupid like national political stuff that they can't affect, that doesn't affect them. I think like these technological advancements, of course, I would say this because I'm a tech person. Other people might say, oh, you need to know about art or literature, but I do think this stuff is practically important because agricultural robotics, while it will, change workforces and labor and so on. And that, by the way, the great resignation is going to catalyze the great automation. Do you know what I mean by that?
Resignation from?
So right now, that's what they're calling it. Lots of people are resigning their jobs.
Okay. Yeah. So this creates more demand for automation or economization.
That's right. Basically, in general, one of the reasons, people think that the North won the Civil War was, among all the obvious moral issues with slavery, it retarded the industrialization of the South,
right? Because
they had slave labor, right? Whereas the North automated and industrialized. And so, in general, if you have too much, I mean, you even see this, like you see this in lots of other contexts, but if you have too much of an abundance of labor, you don't automate. For example, the upper Midwest has a greater degree of automation than like Southern California, because Southern California has many more migrant workers and the upper Midwest has less. Yes. And so they have more agricultural robotics. Go ahead.
And back to the conformity, automation actually displaces slave labor in the long run too, because it makes labor a smaller and smaller component of the cost structure. So eventually the cost of securing your slaves outweighs the benefit.
Well, yeah, exactly. And of course, that's just economics, but the morality of it as well. And, by the way, one thing that I think relatively few people think about, but that's important to know is, the South was slavery, but communism was also slavery. That is to say, when you are taking 100% of somebody's property,
100%
that is
taxation.
Slavery. Yeah, because, basically to make it really clear, people, just to digress on this for a second, the Soviet Union, do you know the White Sea Labor Canal?
I don't.
That's like probably the classic example. These Gulag prisoners were forced to dig a canal with their hands in freezing tundra, because they didn't have this crazy stuff. Wow. It was a horrible canal too, because they didn't use modern construction equipment, so these guys froze to death, died, because in the workers' paradise, you couldn't strike anymore. Right. You couldn't leave your job. It was a gigantic prison state. Go ahead.
No, I'm reminded here where you couldn't even be sad in the Soviet Union, because that would imply that the utopian state was not doing its job. So if you were sad or complaining, you were dealt with. Comrade,
you weren't grateful for Lenin's glorious October Revolution. So now where people will poke on that is, so I think communism, one can safely argue it is slavery, right? Where people will poke on what you said is, and then I'll give a poke on the poke, right? Counter argument is that we've all signed the social contract, right?
Yeah.
And, right. You can, and I think the distinction is free migration possible? Is jurisdictional competition possible? And if it is, then you have opted in to, quote, paying subscription fees to, it's like by entering that jurisdiction, you've, quote, signed a contract, right? By exiting the jurisdiction, you have voided the contract after you've paid what is owed, right? And so I think that is so that means that fundamentally the Soviet Union was illegitimate because it was a prison state. And in fact, all of these communist societies end up restricting emigration. That's why the Berlin Wall was built. Do you know that story?
I know it was built to keep taxpayers in more than it was built to keep people out.
Yeah. So, right. So what was happening was the geography of Berlin after World War II is something that's worth looking on in a map. Is like this weird thing. There's an enclave of West Berlin, like within East Germany, just the nature of how the occupation zones worked after World War II. And by the way, as a side note to a side note, wars are almost like lava flowing. And then when they stop, like where the troops are posted ends up like hardening into things that can last generations of generations. Like the Korean War is over where the Soviet American troops were in, the Korean peninsula and, East Germany and West Germany. Like lots of that stuff is from that hardening that happened, right? Mm-hmm. So basically the geography of West Berlin was such that it was the loophole where people from East Germany could just walk into West Berlin, and many of them defected, especially skilled people who were basically being underpaid in the communist regime, doctors and all these other folks, right? And so eventually this became an embarrassment to the East German regime, and they invented this whole language for it called Republikflucht, do you know this? It's like this one of these German words like Schadenfreude. Have you heard this term before?
I know Schadenfreude. I don't know the first one you said though.
Yeah. So Republikflucht, Republikflucht, was the colloquial term in the German Democratic Republic for illegal emigration to West Germany, West Berlin, non-Warsaw Pact countries, right? And think about how this is how they phrase it. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Both from the moral standpoint, as well as in terms of the interests of the whole German nation, leaving the GDR is an act of moral backwardness and depravity. Those who let themselves be recruited objectively serve West German reaction and militarism, whether they know it or not. Is it not despicable when, for the sake of a few alluring job offers or other false promises about a guaranteed future, one leaves a country in which the seed for a new and more beautiful life is sprouting and is already showing the first fruits, for a place that favors a new war and destruction?
Once again, we're back to this moralistic camouflage that statism dons. It's trying to present itself as some type of deity, misrepresenting itself instead of the truth of it being just a business. I'm reminded too of that line in The Sovereign Individual that says, in this wave of change where people have an option to basically effectively offshore their capital in the digital age, that only the most patriotic or stupid would keep their money in a regime that keeps increasing the tax rate.